In 2023, a single photograph reached a small research team studying one of the most remote rainforests left on Earth. No caption, no location details anyone outside the team was allowed to see. Just one image sent quietly, the way discoveries like this usually start. Not with fanfare, but with someone staring at a screen a little too long. The moment scientist Christopher Helgen looked at it, something didn't add up. Not because the photo was strange, because the animal in it had a name already. A scientific name given in 1999, and according to every official record on the planet, that animal had been extinct for 6,000 years. Helgen didn't say anything right away. He'd seen enough false alarms in his career to know better than to trust a single photograph, but this one stayed with him. Because if it was real, it meant something he'd argued for almost 20 years earlier and been overruled on had been true the entire time. This is the story of how one photograph unraveled a mystery that had been sitting, quietly misfiled, inside a museum for over a decade, and how it led to something even stranger, something that had never happened before in the entire history of this field of science. Not once. To understand why that photograph mattered so much, you have to go back almost 30 years to a cave most people will never hear of again after this video. Krea Cave sits high above the Ayamaru Lakes, on a peninsula in West Papua shaped like the head of a bird, a place cartographers still call the Vogelkop, an old Dutch name that stuck. It's not an easy place to reach even now. There are no highways cutting through it. No towns for long stretches, just dense lowland rainforest folding into limestone ridges that flood in the wet season and turn to knife-edged terrain in the dry one. For most of modern scientific history, this region simply wasn't surveyed, not properly, not the way you'd need to survey it to say, with real confidence, what did or didn't still live there. In 1999, a researcher named Kenneth Aplin pulled bones from the floor of Krea Cave. Not ancient fossils turned to stone over millions of years. These bones were only a few thousand years old, mid-Holocene, in the language of the field, recent enough that when this animal was alive, humans elsewhere were already building the first cities. The bones belonged to a possum, striped black and white, with one finger on each hand stretched strangely long, far longer than anything else on its body, built for something, though nobody knew exactly what yet. Aplin studied the remains, wrote up a formal description, and gave the animal a name. He never saw it alive. Nobody had, not once, in recorded human history. For a while, that was where the story ended. A name attached to a handful of old bones, filed away in a cabinet, another entry on a list of things the world used to have. Then, in 2007, one scientist refused to let it end there. Christopher Helgen, young at the time, working through record after record of Australasian mammals, looked at what little evidence existed for this possum and made a claim almost nobody wanted to hear. He said the region those bones came from had never actually been searched properly, not with the time, the funding, or the access required to say anything with real confidence. An absence of sightings, he argued, wasn't proof of absence. It was proof that nobody had looked hard enough. Nobody listened. Not seriously. In 2009, specialists in extinct and endangered species made it official. Extinct. Then, in 2011, a second independent review reached the same conclusion. Twice, formally, on paper, the case was closed. Helgen's objection became a footnote nobody revisited. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The proof that Helgen was right had already existed for years by the time those rulings were finalized. It just wasn't where anyone thought to look. Somewhere in a museum collection, 2 actual specimens of this animal sat, preserved in fluid. Real ones, collected from the wild at some point, by someone, and processed the way thousands of specimens are processed every year, cleaned, cataloged, and filed under a name. The name was wrong. Whoever handled them had mistaken this possum for a completely different, already known relative, a similar-looking species with a similar build, and filed the specimens under that name instead. The living proof wasn't lost. It was hiding in plain sight, under someone else's identity, a few feet from researchers who had no reason to look twice. And here's the detail that turns this from a filing error into something much harder to sit with. The person who eventually noticed something was wrong with those specimens years later was Kenneth Aplin himself, the same scientist who had named the extinct species from bones back in 1999. He had unknowingly handled proof of his own discovery's survival sitting mislabeled in a drawer, and it took him years to see it. When another researcher, Jackson, formally discussed the mix-up in 2015, Aplin's name was already attached to it, but he would not live to see the case fully closed. He died before anyone could confirm, beyond doubt, that the animal he'd first described from bones in a cave was still breathing somewhere in that forest. A mislabeled jar isn't enough to overturn a formal extinction ruling on its own, though. It tells you the animal existed once. It doesn't tell you whether it still does. So even after 2015, even after the mix-up was known, the official record didn't change. The case stayed open, quietly, unofficially, for almost another decade. A resolved mystery that nobody had the evidence to actually resolve. While that correction sat mostly ignored, something else was happening in the exact same stretch of forest. Something nobody connected to the possum. Not yet. Around 2023, near the town of Sorong, on that same peninsula, a completely different animal started showing up in scattered reports. Nocturnal, gliding between trees using skin stretched wide between its limbs, the way a handful of marsupials elsewhere are known to do. A tail long and strong enough to grip a branch almost like a hand. A photograph surfaced. Grainy, taken at night, easy to dismiss. Then something harder to dismiss turned up. On Misul Island, far south of where anyone expected, in terrain barely explored at all, a physical specimen appeared. Not a photo this time. An actual animal. Examined, measured, real. At first, researchers assumed it was simply a relative of Australia's greater glider, a known, well-documented species from a completely different landmass, thousands of kilometers away. Nothing unusual, on paper, just a range extension, the kind of thing that gets a short note in a journal and nothing more. But the proportions were wrong. The ears didn't match anything on record. Something about this animal refused to fit cleanly into a category anyone already had. So someone went back to Krea Cave. The same fossil layer that had produced the striped possum's bones over 20 years earlier, and found a match. Two completely different lost animals, sealed in the same handful of ancient stone, 6,000 to 7,000 years old, waiting for the same unlikely chain of events to bring them both back into the light at once. That's the moment this stopped being two separate curiosities and became one investigation. Leading it was Tim Flannery, a zoologist already known well beyond academic circles. He'd written a widely read book on climate change back in 2005, the kind of scientist used to explaining difficult things to people who weren't specialists. But this case wasn't one he could solve from a desk. It needed something harder to build than a research grant. Trust. Not just with fellow scientists at the University of Papua, but with the people who actually live beside this forest. Elders from the Tambrau and Maybrat communities, whose relationship with Flannery had been built slowly, over years, long before this particular mystery ever surfaced. That relationship mattered because this land does not forgive outsiders who think they can simply walk in with a research permit and a GPS unit. There are no roads deep enough to reach the true interior, no trail markers, no visitor center, no ranger station, no map you could trust past the first few kilometers. Surveys that work perfectly well in a national park back home mean almost nothing here. If these two animals were still alive, the only realistic chance of proving it belonged to people who had spent their entire lives reading that terrain, by sound, by smell, by the shape of a broken branch. The way you or I might read a familiar street. So that's what happened. Not one dramatic breakthrough, filmed and clean. 2 years of quiet, unglamorous, often frustrating work. Much of it in conditions that made a single confirmed sighting feel like a minor miracle. A rare photograph here, a specimen there, examined and re-examined for anything that might rule it out, and something that reportedly stopped researchers cold. Descriptions from Tambrau and Maybrat elders that matched the fossil evidence with unsettling precision. Elders who had never seen a museum specimen, never studied the bones from Krea Cave, described the glider's body as roughly the length of 2 open hands laid end to end. That description lined up with the physical evidence almost to the inch. It raised an uncomfortable question none of the researchers could avoid. If the knowledge required to identify this animal had existed, unbroken, in these communities the entire time, how many other supposedly extinct species were sitting in the same gap between what scientists had recorded and what the people living there had simply always known? Piece by piece, an answer that had taken nearly 2 decades to assemble finally came together. Both animals were alive, not one species back from the dead, 2 from the same cave, confirmed within days of each other. Now, after a search that had spanned continents, generations, and, in Kenneth Aplin's case, outlived the scientist who first set it in motion. When the research was finally published in March 2026, in 2 companion papers in the records of the Australian Museum, even the scientists who had spent years chasing this story sounded stunned by their own findings. Finding one Lazarus species like this, one of them said, would already be extraordinary. The kind of result that defines a career. Finding 2 from the same fossil site in the same investigation had no clean precedent, nothing to directly compare it to anywhere in the scientific literature. But the story wasn't finished, not even close. Because the closer researchers looked at the glider, the less it made sense. If stories like this are exactly why you love nature and real scientific mysteries, subscribe now. Every week, we dig into discoveries that sound impossible but are completely true. At first, the assumption held up fine. A new species, sure. Unexpected but explainable. Still part of the same broader family as Australia's greater glider. Something that could slot neatly into an existing branch of the family tree, get a name, and close the file. It didn't slot in anywhere. When scientists compared its skull, its ears, its proportions against every known relative, none of it matched cleanly. This wasn't a variation on something already cataloged. It needed an entirely new genus, a whole new limb added to the marsupial family tree, something taxonomists don't do lightly or often. Researchers gave that new genus a name drawn directly from the people who had known the animal longest, Taus, from the Maybrat language, the name elders had always used for it. Not a Latin invention built in a lab, but a word borrowed from generations of observation that predated the science by centuries. The last time an entirely new genus of marsupial had been formally recognized from New Guinea was 1937, almost 90 years earlier, and there's a detail that makes this even harder to process. Geologically speaking, the peninsula where all of this happened isn't originally part of New Guinea at all. It's believed to be a fragment of the ancient Australian continent. A piece of land that broke away over millions of years and eventually fused onto the island as it exists today, carrying its own isolated cargo of plants and animals along with it. Which means this one small, hard-to-reach corner of forest is a literal remnant of a world that no longer exists anywhere else on Earth. Finding an entire hidden branch of the marsupial family tree, there isn't just lucky. It's almost exactly what you'd expect if you understood what that land actually was. The possum, too, turned out to need its own reclassification. It had originally been placed in a genus shared with other striped possums. Now, with fresh specimens finally available to study directly instead of only bones, researchers determined it deserved its own distinct genus as well. 2 separate taxonomic overhauls for 2 separate animals, confirmed in the same investigation, not just individual survivors clinging on at the edge of extinction, entire forgotten branches of the family tree, hiding in plain sight the whole time. And the details kept accumulating, each one adding weight to how fragile this all still was. The possum, it turned out, hunts using a kind of built-in sonar. Specialized structures in its ear region let it detect the low-frequency sound of beetle larvae chewing inside rotting wood. Then it uses that impossibly long finger to tear the bark open and fish the grub out, the same way another mammal, half a world away in Madagascar, has evolved to do independently. Nature had apparently solved this exact problem twice, on 2 different landmasses, with 2 completely unrelated animals. The glider lived an even more delicate existence. It fed on tree sap and leaves, likely supplemented with fruit and small invertebrates, a narrow, specific diet that only certain old-growth trees could support. And unlike many small mammals that breed quickly to offset high mortality, this glider forms lifelong pair bonds and raises only one young per year. A slow, careful reproductive strategy that works fine in a stable, undisturbed forest. It leaves almost no margin for error in a forest that isn't stable anymore. Here's the detail that stays with you longest, though. While Western science spent nearly 2 decades treating this glider as a ghost, a line in an extinction report, a set of bones in a cave, a mislabeled jar nobody double-checked, the Tambrow and Maybrat people living beside that forest never lost track of it. They already had a name for it. They'd had one long before Tus ever appeared in a scientific journal, and to them, it was never just an animal. According to the elders who worked directly with the research team, this glider is tied to the spirits of their ancestors. The forest it lives in isn't described by them as habitat, in the clinical sense scientists usually reach for. It's described as the place where all living things came from. For thousands of years, while formal records insisted this creature no longer existed, the people who actually shared the land with it treated it as something closer to sacred than extinct. So which record was right the whole time? The one built from bones, cautious paperwork, and 2 formal extinction rulings? Or the one carried forward, unbroken, generation after generation, by people who never needed a fossil to tell them what was still walking through their own forest? The moment this became public, in early March 2026, a new problem appeared almost overnight, one none of the celebration could really soften. The instant the world learns a rare, striking, previously unknown animal is real, that animal becomes valuable in the worst possible way. Both species turned out to be extremely specialized. Particular diets, particular microhabitats, the kind of animals that would very likely sicken and die within days if pulled out of the exact ecosystem they'd evolved around. That doesn't stop buyers. It rarely does. So the precise coordinates of where these 2 animals live are being kept out of the public record, not hidden from other scientists who need that information to protect them properly, hidden from anyone who might try to capture one, sell it, and watch it die within weeks in a cage somewhere, just to say they'd owned something almost nobody else on Earth had. There's a second threat behind that one. Slower, quieter, arguably more dangerous in the long run. Ecologists studying this region have raised real, documented concern about how quickly the surrounding old-growth forest is being cleared, largely for logging. The same isolation that let these 2 lineages survive completely undetected for 6,000 to 7,000 years. The lack of roads, the near impossible terrain, the sheer difficulty of getting anyone in far enough to look, is the exact thing keeping them alive right now. That isolation is already shrinking. Every year, a little more of it disappears, long before most of the world even learns what it was protecting. There's an eerie symmetry running through all of this because this isn't even the first time something like it has happened in this part of the world. Back in 1966, another small marsupial, also known only from fossils, also formally written off as extinct, turned out to be alive after all, found decades after scientists assumed that particular story was closed for good. Researchers working in this region have learned, more than once now, that extinct sometimes just means nobody has looked hard enough yet, in the right place, with the right people, asking the right questions. What sets this case apart is that it happened twice, in the same handful of ancient bones, confirmed within days of each other, after nearly 20 years in which one dissenting scientist, one mislabeled jar in a museum, and one community's unbroken knowledge all had to eventually collide. And it may not even end there. The papers describing these 2 animals were published as part of a larger collection of research on New Guinea's mammals. 8 studies in total, released together, including the description of an entirely new bandicoot species and fresh genetic work on tree kangaroos most people have never heard of, 1 forest, 1 round of fieldwork, and an entire wave of animals nobody had accounted for suddenly surfacing at once. Think about everything that had to line up for this particular story to end the way it did. Bones had to survive undisturbed in a cave for thousands of years. A scientist had to be willing, in 2007, to publicly disagree with a ruling that wouldn't be proven wrong for almost 2 decades. 2 specimens had to sit misidentified in a collection, not lost, not destroyed, just wrongly labeled, waiting for the very man who first described the species to stumble onto his own mistake years later and to die without ever seeing it confirmed. A grainy photograph had to be taken by the right person at the right moment and taken seriously instead of dismissed. A specimen had to surface on an island most people couldn't find on a map, and an entire community had to be willing to share knowledge they'd carried for generations with outsiders who, until very recently, hadn't thought to ask. Remove one piece of that chain, and none of it happens. The bones stay bones. The extinction listing stays on the books for another decade, maybe longer, and 2 lineages that had already been quietly surviving in that forest for thousands of years stay exactly what they'd always been to the outside world: invisible. There are still hundreds of places on Earth that scientists have barely set foot in, and if one forgotten forest could hide 2 species the world had given up on for 7,000 years, it's worth asking what else might still be out there, waiting for someone to look twice. Subscribe, because our next documentary might be the one that finds it.